thought it was about time to bust this guy out. Here we have a 1988 Terminator Marine by Jez Goodwin, the first Space Marine Terminator miniature and the inspiration for the modern Saturnine Terminators. Which is interesting, as calling this specific design a Saturnine was very much a fandom thing that caught on enough that GW just made it canon. But since the name Saturnine had been floating around for a while for a kind of Terminator armour, and this design didn't really have an official name, you can see how that happened. Anyway, these original ones were tiny compared to the hefty modern lads, not least because they needed to fit on a 25mm base. And though mine has got a little wear and tear to its sculpt, I think that just adds character. Although, considering this thing already has shoulder pads the size of armchairs and a head the size and shape of a pea, that was a department it wasn't exactly lacking in to begin with.
This is a 1989 Space Marine Librarian with Force Sword. You might notice that this is a Rogue Trader Space Marine who does not have a beaked helmet, but instead sports something kinda resembling a Mark VII helmet. To be honest, 1989 was just a year of Mark 7-ish looking guys that don't look quite right being sold alongside beakies, biding their time until they'd become the standard in the early 90s. Also, if this one were painted in era-appropriate 1989 colours, it wouldn't need to be blue since, generally speaking, librarians would just wear standard chapter colours, which is mildly interesting.
Given how many times I've talked about loving old 40k minis, you might think there's none I actually dislike. But that is far from the truth. I can be as much of a hater as anyone else. For example, I don't really care for the multi-part plastic Orks from the RTB13 box from 1990, an example of which is in front of your eyeballs. They're just not great minis on a lot of fronts. Subjectively, I just don't think they're as characterful as the earlier or later Ork sculpts, but more objectively, they just don't fit together particularly well, something exacerbated by a scrunched up posture that limits a lot of what you can do with them since you have a lot of things wanting to inhabit the same space at the same time, and things like the facial details are kind of vague. Although I think I'm a bit more bitter at them than I normally would be just because I have a bunch of them left to finish painting and I can't be arsed.
Here we have a couple of 2nd edition Necron scarabs from 1998. They're pretty huge as far as scarabs go, and their little skull faces are quite adorable. Although, probably the most interesting thing about them is that this was not their intended way of being based. And not just because GW didn't make 40mm round bases when these were released. Originally, these little guys would just be placed on the table with no base at all. Which feels very, very wrong in a way I can't quite quantify. It's one thing to do it with epic scale minis, but something about doing it in 40k with something that isn't a large vehicle feels like it's breaking a fundamental rule of the universe, you know?
Although this series of shorts is usually about us looking at old miniatures, one of the cool things about collecting this stuff in the present day is that there are plenty of people out there crafting their own new, retro-styled miniatures. Here we have a particularly nice one in the form of a Rocknaut Tirestorm biker from Ontos Games, which, full disclosure, was sent to me for free by them with no strings attached. Mostly because Chris is lovely. And I really like how this captures that chunky style of mid-90s minis, but with the clean finish of a modern sculpt. I do always appreciate a mini that can take an edge highlighting like a champ. Also, yes, of course I based this colour scheme explicitly on the squats from the cover of White Dwarf 111. Anything else would have felt wrong.
Here we have an Eldar warrior from Space Crusade, or more specifically from its 1991 expansion Eldar Attack. These were made in the same style as the Space Crusade Marines in that their weapons could be swapped around if you wished. Although having a shuriken catapult as the default weapon is notable as Eldar Guardians, which this is absolutely modelled off, would not have a shuriken catapult be the default until 3rd edition 40k. Also, we hope you enjoy the colour scheme of this mini. It is lore-friendly as it shows they're from the Ally Mercenary Corps. This means there's nothing to stop you putting your fancy new Eldar Corsairs in bright pink underpants.
One of the decisions you have to make whilst collecting old minis is, do you keep them stock, or do you allow yourself to modify them? And if you do, are you going to try and keep it in the style people did at the time? And which of these options is more authentic as a collector? I don't necessarily think there's a correct answer there, it's mostly down to individual tastes, but to me, I'm content to convert, I just try and keep it as authentic to the time as possible, as you can see here with my Smash Captain made from an RTB01 plastic marine. He's had his legs reposed, he's been given a hammer mostly made from an RTB01 sprue, he's got a metal jump pack, and a shield that's actually from the 90s, but don't worry about it. Annoyingly, I don't think I've ever actually got to use him on the table since they changed how characters worked in 10th, which certainly makes me feel good about the amount of time I put into this mini.
I think our fondness for dreadnoughts is pretty well established on this channel, and the tiny epic scale ones are no exception. This little dreadnought is from the Epic Stompers box from 1991. Although it's pretty easily recognisable as an early version of a modern Contemptor pattern dreadnought, at the time this was simply a dreadnought, without any special naming convention or differentiation. And I suppose given that the box it came in also contained the Chaos Dreads that used the Space Crusade design, and Epic Stompers was released a few years before early Boxnauts showed up, it offers a tantalising glimpse into a universe where these designs caught on and became the defaults rather than the boxy Castroferums.
This is a Bauhaus Ducal Militia Sergeant from the Mutant Chronicles Warzone 2nd Edition box set. A mini I quite like, despite it doing absolutely everything to try and annoy me. So, for one, this pistol is not what the mini is actually armed with in-game. It should be an assault rifle. It also comes with this little shield on its sprue that will perplex you for a while there, trying to figure out exactly where it goes, before you figure out it's actually meant for an entirely different mini. And finally, the included slotter base has its slot dead center rather than being slightly offset like most are, which means he naturally sits too far forward on the base. You can fix this by just removing it from the tab or using another base, obviously, but I wanted to make this one in its original configuration so that I can show you how mildly aggravating it is. Just, why would they actively choose to make it like this?
There were a lot of different Ork Boys minis released in Rogue Trader, some all metal, some all plastic, and some, like this example circa 1990, mixed the two together by having metal bodies for you to attach plastic arms and weapons to, which played into the strengths of both by allowing for easier customization while still keeping the more intricate and characterful sculpts metal casting allowed at the time. This one also has a bright pink mohawk. Well, technically a hair squig styled as a mohawk. That's not important to the history of the mini, but the mohawk is loud enough that we felt like we had to at least mention it.